Imagine waking up in a world where mornings unfolded slowly, guided not by smartphones buzzing, but by the familiar rhythm of household sounds. The clink of silverware on plates, the hiss of bacon in a skillet, and the gentle bubbling of a coffee percolator were the soundtrack to starting the day. The 1960s were a decade of contrasts, filled with change, innovation, and bold culture shifts, but breakfast remained a grounding ritual, an anchor that tied families together no matter what the world outside was doing. For many, the day began with the scent of toast warming in a chrome pop-up toaster or the earthy richness of oatmeal simmering on the stove. Some mornings were quick and practical, while others lingered with spreads of biscuits, pancakes, and waffles stacked high. These breakfasts weren't just about filling stomachs, they were about fueling lives, nurturing bonds, and carrying traditions forward into a rapidly changing era. Close your eyes, and maybe you can still picture it. A father unfolding the morning paper at the table, children passing a plate of buttered toast, orange juice served in squat glass tumblers, and the comforting weight of a meal that felt as familiar as the sun rising. These breakfasts of the 1960s weren't fancy, but they were unforgettable. If you're ready to step back into a decade when mornings were slower, meals were heartier, and kitchens were filled with smells that still linger in memory, then this journey is for you. Stay with us as we revisit 25 forgotten breakfasts that defined American families in the 1960s. Share this story with someone who grew up during this era, or recreate one of these meals at home. Because when you bring back the food of the past, you also bring back the stories, the laughter, and the love that came with it. Breakfast in a changing America. The 1960s were unlike any decade before them. The nation was in the middle of a cultural revolution. Rock and roll blared from radios, televisions flickered with black and white sitcoms and news reports, and suburban homes expanded faster than ever. Yet, amid all the change, the kitchen table remained a cornerstone of daily life. Breakfast was where the day started, no matter if it was a bustling school morning or a quiet Sunday. Convenience foods were making waves, frozen waffles, instant oatmeal, and boxed cereals, yet many households still clung to homemade staples. Mothers were balancing tradition with modernity, trying out instant mixes one morning and then kneading biscuit dough the next. Food companies pushed brightly packaged products with jingles that kids hummed while waiting in line at the cafeteria, but grandparents still insisted that nothing could beat a hot homemade breakfast cooked on the stove. Breakfast in the 1960s was not just fuel, it was a cultural snapshot. It revealed the balance between old and new, the pull of tradition and the allure of modern convenience. Let's relive the foods that carried families through those mornings. Bacon and eggs, the all-American starter. There was no meal that better represented the American ideal of breakfast than bacon and eggs. It wasn't just a dish, it was a ritual. The sound of bacon sizzling in the skillet was practically a morning alarm clock. Eggs, whether scrambled fluffy and golden, fried until the edges crisped, or poached delicately, provided a protein-packed backbone that filled everyone with energy for the day ahead. The pairing was more than about taste, it was about identity. In diners across the country, bacon and eggs became shorthand for breakfast itself. In suburban homes, it symbolized stability and prosperity. A plate with crispy bacon strips and perfectly cooked eggs was the epitome of comfort and satisfaction. Children grew up equating this meal with love, because someone had to rise early, stand by the stove, and make it fresh. That act of care was as nourishing as the food itself. Even today, when many of us rush out the door with just coffee, the smell of bacon and eggs cooking can instantly transport us back to the kitchen tables of the 1960s. Cream of wheat and oatmeal, warm comfort in a bowl. Not every breakfast in the 1960s was indulgent. Sometimes it was about practicality, nourishment, and simplicity. Cream of wheat and oatmeal filled that role perfectly. Served steaming in bowls, these hot cereals warmed bellies on chilly mornings, often sweetened with a pat of butter, a sprinkle of sugar, or a drizzle of honey. In many homes, fruit was added, sliced bananas, raisins, or berries when they were in season. For some kids, oatmeal felt like a chore to eat, but for parents, it was a comfort food that connected back to their own childhoods during the Depression years, when simple grains stretched to feed large families. These bowls carried a sense of economy and care, proof that even with limited resources, breakfast could still feel abundant. More than that, they were endlessly customizable. No two bowls looked the same, but each carried with it the warmth of home. Cornflakes and Cheerios, the rise of cold cereal. By the 1960s, cold cereals weren't just popular, they were cultural icons. Cornflakes and Cheerios had become staples, and colorful boxes sat proudly on pantry shelves. Cereal commercials filled the airwaves, and kids eagerly poured their favorite into bowls before rushing off to school. It wasn't just about convenience, though. Cereal became tied to childhood joy. Many children of the era remember carefully fishing for the little plastic toys tucked inside boxes. Milk poured over crispy flakes or round O's created an experience that was both simple and magical. For parents, cereal was a godsend. It was fast, required no cooking, and could satisfy even picky eaters. For kids, it was the breakfast equivalent of candy that somehow got parental approval. This balance of convenience and fun made cereal one of the defining breakfast foods of the 1960s. Toast with butter and jam, the everyday classic. There were mornings when the kitchen didn't smell like bacon or sizzling sausage, but instead carried the quiet comfort of toast. Popped from gleaming chrome toasters, slices of white bread emerged golden and ready to be transformed. Butter melted into the surface instantly, followed by a spread of jam, strawberry, grape, or whatever jar sat in the pantry. For many families, the jam wasn't store-bought but homemade, preserved during summers when fruits were abundant. Spreading that jam on toast wasn't just about taste, it was about memory, about extending the harvest into the colder months. Toast with butter and jam may not have been glamorous, but it was dependable. It gave kids the fuel to get through the first hours of school, and parents the satisfaction of knowing they had started the day with something wholesome, even if time was short. Biscuits and gravy, a Southern Sunday tradition. Few breakfasts embodied the soul of the South like biscuits and gravy. Light, fluffy biscuits rose golden in the oven, ready to be split and smothered with thick, peppery sausage gravy. This dish wasn't reserved for everyday mornings. It was often saved for Sundays when families had the time to sit down together without rushing out the door. Making biscuits from scratch took skill, from cutting the butter into the flour just right to knowing when to pull them out of the oven. Grandmothers often passed down these techniques to daughters and granddaughters, turning biscuit making into an heirloom skill. The gravy, rich and hearty, was poured generously, transforming a plate of biscuits into something filling and unforgettable. Biscuits and gravy weren't just food. They were a reminder of heritage, of resilience, and of the simple joy of gathering together over a meal that filled both stomach and spirit. Pancakes and syrup, the weekend treat. In many households, Saturday or Sunday mornings meant one thing: pancakes. Whether made from scratch or from a boxed mix, pancakes were the kind of breakfast that encouraged families to linger a little longer at the table. The golden stacks, topped with butter that melted into little rivers, were drizzled with syrup, sometimes maple, sometimes the corn syrup-based varieties that lined grocery store shelves. Children loved helping flip the pancakes, a small rite of passage that made them feel grown up. Pancakes weren't just breakfast, they were an event. The laughter, the chatter, and the act of sharing a stack together created a memory that stuck with kids long after the last bite. Waffles with fruit or syrup. If pancakes were a weekend classic, waffles were their fancier cousin. Crisp and golden on the outside, fluffy on the inside, waffles were sometimes made from scratch with heavy irons that had been in the family for years. But by the 1960s, Eggo-frozen waffles had made their way into kitchens, providing a quick alternative that still felt like a treat. Waffles were versatile, topped with fruit, powdered sugar, or whipped cream when available, or simply drizzled with syrup. They carried with them a sense of indulgence that elevated an ordinary morning. Whether homemade or from a toaster, waffles were a unifying joy of the 1960s breakfast table. Like biscuits and gravy, grits were deeply rooted in Southern kitchens. Made from ground corn, grits were boiled until creamy, then seasoned with butter, cheese, or even sausage gravy. They were inexpensive, filling, and adaptable, making them a perfect breakfast for large families. Though not every child loved the texture, grits carried with them the weight of tradition. They represented resourcefulness, stretching ingredients to create something that sustained and comforted. In many ways, grits symbolized the balance of simplicity and richness that defined Southern breakfasts of the 1960s. Sausage links and patties. Where bacon reigned supreme in many homes, sausage had a kingdom of its own. Whether in links or patties, sausage was a staple of hearty breakfasts. The seasoned, sizzling meat paired beautifully with eggs, biscuits, or pancakes, and its aroma often mingled with that of coffee, filling the entire kitchen with warmth. Sausage provided variety and choice, ensuring that even if families ate eggs every day, the meal could still feel different. It also reflected regional traditions, with spice blends and preparations varying from state to state. Sausage wasn't just a side, it was often the centerpiece of the morning plate. By now, you can almost hear the clatter of plates, the hum of morning chatter, and the timeless sounds of the kitchen alive with sizzling and simmering. The first half of our journey through forgotten breakfasts of the 1960s reveals not just food, but the rituals and rhythms that shaped American mornings. These meals weren't just about filling bellies, they were about grounding families, creating traditions, and starting each day with something familiar and comforting. Don't step away just yet, because in Next, we will uncover even more breakfast classics from the 1960s. From cinnamon rolls to quirky cereal fads, coffee cakes to casseroles, we'll continue exploring the forgotten treasures that once graced the morning table. Share this with someone who remembers the joy of gathering at the table in the 60s, and let's keep these memories alive, one breakfast at a time. Breakfasts that defined the rhythm of a family morning. By the time the 1960s were in full swing, American families had settled into a kind of morning rhythm. Breakfast wasn't just about nutrition, it was about setting the tone for the day, a ritual that combined nourishment, comfort, and togetherness. In many households, mothers rose early, often before dawn, to prepare breakfast for the family. Fathers grabbed their coffee while scanning the morning newspaper, and children sat eagerly, sometimes half asleep, waiting for their favorite dish to hit the table. The second half of our journey into the breakfasts of the 1960s digs even deeper into the forgotten classics, those comforting meals that not only filled bellies but also shaped a generation's cultural memory. Some of these dishes were tied to traditions from immigrant families, others were products of clever kitchen improvisations, and many reflected the innovations of convenience foods that transformed American kitchens. What makes these breakfasts unforgettable isn't simply the ingredients or recipes, it's the way they encapsulated a moment in American history when the family table was still the center of everyday life. Fried cornmeal mush with syrup. Cornmeal mush has been around for centuries, but in the 1960s it was a reliable, thrifty breakfast, especially in working-class homes. Mothers would cook up a pot of cornmeal and water the night before, letting it cool and solidify overnight. The next morning, the hardened mush was sliced, fried in butter or bacon grease until golden, and served with maple syrup, honey, or sometimes a sprinkle of sugar and cinnamon. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling, cheap, and adaptable. For many children, it carried the same comforting weight as pancakes or waffles. The crispy edges and soft, creamy middle offered a textural contrast that made it surprisingly delightful. In many households, this breakfast also carried whispers of the Depression and wartime eras, when families learned to stretch ingredients and make the most out of humble staples. Even decades later, people who grew up in the 1960s recall fried cornmeal mush with a kind of fondness that transcends its simplicity. It was the kind of dish that proved you didn't need extravagance to start the day right. Danish and coffee for the adults. While kids were diving into cereal or eggs, many parents in the 1960s were embracing a simpler, more modern approach to breakfast. Coffee became the centerpiece of the adult morning ritual, often brewed in percolators that hissed and gurgled on stovetops. Alongside that steaming mug, many adults grabbed a Danish pastry, flaky, sweet, and increasingly available thanks to the rise of mass-produced bakery goods. This shift toward pastry and coffee breakfasts reflected broader cultural changes. As suburban families became busier and mornings more rushed, convenience trumped tradition. A prepackaged Danish and a cup of strong coffee gave adults just enough fuel to get through commutes and office jobs. It wasn't the hearty eggs and bacon breakfast of earlier generations, but it captured the emerging modern lifestyle of the decade. Popovers with butter and jam. Popovers were a special treat in many households, a kind of American adaptation of Yorkshire pudding. These light, airy pastries puffed up dramatically in the oven, their hollow centers begging to be filled with butter, jam, or even a drizzle of honey. In the 1960s, families loved popovers not only for their taste, but for the little bit of magic they seemed to bring to the table. Watching the popovers rise was part of the excitement. For children, it felt almost like a kitchen science experiment that transformed ordinary flour, milk, and eggs into something extraordinary. Popovers weren't an everyday breakfast. They took a little more time and patience, but when they appeared, they made mornings feel festive. Many mothers served them on Sundays or holidays, creating an association with celebration that made them unforgettable. Rice pudding for breakfast. Rice pudding wasn't just a dessert in the 1960s. It often appeared at the breakfast table. Leftover rice from dinner the night before would be reheated with milk, sugar, and cinnamon to create a warm, comforting porridge. Sometimes raisins were added, and in immigrant households, variations carried flavors from Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, blending tradition with American practicality. For children, rice pudding was one of those breakfasts that blurred the line between meal and treat. It was creamy, sweet, and endlessly customizable. Parents loved it because it prevented food waste, turning leftovers into something that felt intentional and delicious. In many ways, rice pudding for breakfast represented the heart of 1960s family kitchens. Resourceful, comforting, and quietly indulgent. Sticky cinnamon rolls. Few breakfasts from the 1960s inspire as much nostalgia as sticky cinnamon rolls. Homemade versions involved rolling dough with butter, sugar, and cinnamon, then baking until golden before drizzling with glaze or sticky caramel. But as convenience foods grew in popularity, refrigerated cinnamon roll cans also became common, making this indulgence more accessible than ever. For children, waking up to the smell of cinnamon rolls baking was pure magic. It made ordinary mornings feel like Christmas. Families often reserved them for weekends or special occasions, ensuring they were tied to moments of togetherness and joy. The sticky sweetness, the gooey centers, and the mess of licking frosting off fingers cemented cinnamon rolls as one of the most beloved 1960s breakfasts. Even today, they're a nostalgic treat that instantly transports people back to their childhood kitchens. Scrapple and eggs. Scrapple was another breakfast with deep roots in thrift and tradition. Made from pork scraps combined with cornmeal and spices, it was shaped into loaves, sliced and pan-fried, until crispy on the outside. Served with eggs and sometimes topped with maple syrup, scrapple was a hearty, savory dish that reflected the resourcefulness of American cooks. Though it had regional popularity, especially in the Mid-Atlantic, many 1960s families nationwide grew up with scrapple on their breakfast tables. It wasn't everyone's favorite. Its strong flavor and unusual texture divided opinions, but for those who loved it, it was a cherished part of their morning routine. Scrapple also highlighted the way 1960s families balanced tradition and practicality, keeping alive recipes that stretched ingredients and honored frugality while still delivering big flavors. Homemade coffee cake. Coffee cake was a staple of 1960s breakfasts, often baked on Sundays or for guests. Despite its name, it wasn't always paired with coffee. It was a moist, cinnamon-swirled cake topped with crumbly streusel that could easily stand alone. For many families, a warm slice of coffee cake represented both comfort and hospitality. In the 1960s, packaged mixes made baking coffee cake easier, but homemade versions remained a point of pride. Mothers would pass down recipes, often scribbled on index cards, creating traditions that lasted for generations. Coffee cake was versatile. It could be eaten on the go, shared with neighbors, or served at leisurely family breakfasts. Its sweet, spiced aroma often lingered in kitchens long after the last slice was gone. Creamed chipped beef on toast. A dish with roots in military rations, creamed chipped beef on toast, often affectionately called SOS by servicemen, found its way into 1960s family kitchens. Made from dried beef in a creamy white sauce poured over toasted bread, it was salty, rich, and surprisingly satisfying. For many families, especially those with fathers who had served in World War II or Korea, creamed chipped beef carried a sense of nostalgia and familiarity. It was inexpensive, easy to make, and hearty enough to fuel a busy day. Though not as glamorous as pancakes or waffles, this breakfast was reliable and comforting, a reminder that sometimes the simplest meals carry the deepest connections. Jell-O with fruit for breakfast. The 1960s were the golden age of Jell-O, and it wasn't reserved just for dessert. Many families served Jell-O with fruit as part of breakfast, sometimes paired with cottage cheese or whipped cream. It was colorful, fun, and a little bit whimsical, perfect for capturing children's attention in the morning. Jell-O breakfasts also reflected the rise of convenience foods. Easy to prepare in advance, they allowed busy mothers to serve something light and sweet without much effort. While it might seem unusual today, for 1960s families it was a bright, jiggly symbol of modern living. The Sunday Big Breakfast tradition. Perhaps the most defining feature of 1960s breakfasts was the weekly ritual of the Big Breakfast. Sundays often meant the family gathered for a spread that went beyond the weekday routine: pancakes, waffles, eggs, bacon, sausage, hash browns, and toast all piled onto the table. This meal wasn't just about food, it was about family. It gave everyone a chance to slow down, share stories, and connect before the week began again. For many children, Sunday breakfast became some of the most enduring memories of their youth, a tradition that tied food to love and togetherness. As we close out this journey through 25 forgotten breakfasts of the 1960s, one truth becomes clear. Breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day, it was a reflection of an entire way of life. These meals carried the flavors of tradition, the innovations of a changing era, and the warmth of family togetherness. Though many of these dishes have faded from modern tables, their memory lingers in stories and recipes tucked away in cookbooks, and in the hearts of those who grew up with them. They remind us that food is never just about nourishment. It's about connection, culture, and the little rituals that define our days. So why not bring a bit of the past into your present? Try recreating one of these breakfasts, whether it's fried cornmeal mush, sticky cinnamon rolls, or a full Sunday spread. Share it with your family, your children, or your friends, and see how nostalgia has the power to make food taste even better. And if this trip down memory lane stirred your appetite, don't forget to share it with someone who remembers the 1960s, or someone who's curious to taste what life was like in that unforgettable decade.